Hello and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
I'm Kristen.
And tonight we talk about peanut butter.
And jelly.
Wait,
and
what?
The mess you made before the show.
I did a boo-boo. Erased all our show notes. Oopsies.
And then what's interesting, the tool to get the way you go through to get it back is you go to a JSON API, which is the most bizarre thing. But anyway.
Why don't they just have, we use Trello for our show notes. And so why don't they just have show me the last version button?
Yeah.
If they,
yeah,
obviously
well,
they keep it because they have a JSON for it.
But then they'd have to program the interface for it if they had that.
Laziness. Maybe they ought to put that on a Trello card for a future feature.
Yep.
Anyway, so before we get into talking about, what are we talking about? The Jamstack.
Jamstack.
What did you do this week?
Did some database consulting, some Rails consulting, and dealing with the bloody spammers.
Oh, those bastards.
The form spammers. I hate the form spammers. Anyway, so spent some time working, combating those foes. Did some other feature development related to my app and had an interesting issue. I use the audited gem, which is a Ruby library that you can configure your models whenever there is some sort of change and insert, update, delete, that it records the fact that it was done. And if it is a change, it shows you what was old, what was there before, what's there in the model now. And if you delete it, it shows you what was there. So I've used it for my system to track a whole bunch of different things just to know when things have changed. It's not really, hasn't been a core part of the feature set. Like if anything is missed, it's not a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to do something, start using it for a purpose because it already did close to what I needed it to do. I started to use it for a purpose that I really do need it to always work. And basically auditing whether a financial transaction was changed. And strangely enough, someone did a change to one of these transactions and there's nothing recorded. So I have no idea what that's about or why that happened. So I'm like, well, I got to depend on this thing. So basically I coded my own way for this particular feature. I was like, all right, I'm going to do this to be able to track this. And it also had an added benefit because people wanted to be able to call it via an API. And I'm able to put it in a more consistent and what I consider usable structure compared to the way the audited gem did it. But I was just so frustrated the fact that I clearly saw that the data changed. I can look in the logs and I can see what was there before, what was changed, and there was no entry in the table that it places in them. So I don't know what was going on.
Weird.
Anyway, so what about you?
Well, this week has been kind of weird. I haven't actually done a whole lot of programming. I've been mostly playing politics with a big client. The political
Yay.
back and forth of it's just, and I have zero patience for that kind of crap. It just drives me nuts. I don't like politics and bureaucracy and stuff, so it's just annoying for me. But with big corporations, sometimes that's just the game you got to play. And so I did a lot of that with support and feature requests and stuff, back and forth on those things. And so not a tremendous amount of actual coding. I fixed a couple little nitnoids. And actually, what I did spend a good amount of time on over the past week was pairing with one of the other engineers who's working on upgrading our big core service from Rails 5.2 up to Rails 7. So yeah, so
Are you
not
doing?
no.
Wait.
We're going to 6 first.
Okay. All right. I
Yeah,
was just making sure. Okay.
but the project is to get us to 7.
Right. Right. Right.
So
The ultimate goal.
right.
Yeah.
So and he was gonna do all the way to 7, and I'm like, oh no, let's go to 6, put it up in production, take a breath, let it shake out, and then we'll go to 6.1, let that
Yeah,
shake out.
because that's and Rails designed it that way because they've got I can't remember what it's called, but there's feature sliders. So you go to 6, and even once you go to 6, there are 15, 20 features that are disabled.
Right.
And the intent is to go in, I think framework defaults or something like that. And you
Yeah.
go in and you make sure you're ready. And then you individually flip each one of those switches as you're ready. Then
Right.
you're saying, okay, now we're fully on 6 and we're ready to go to 6.1. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And it's been going relatively smoothly for the most part. The biggest stumbling blocks we've had is just weird things in some of the tests where, we like deep down in the bowels of something, some gem changed how they were, changed a method call or something. So we have to crawl down through all that stuff and say, oh, or go look at the readmes for the past few years of the gem and see, oh, well, at this version they changed this method call, so we have to swap to this. That's been the biggest kind of headache. But it's, I mean, all in all, based on the fact that I've done several of these and that this code base is really big, I was pretty worried about this. It's been relatively smooth. So that's a happy thing.
I always find it interesting. It's the gems that are always the issue and not really the code of the application that you're upgrading.
Right. And this wouldn't have been as bad. This is kind of a lesson. I never advocate being bleeding edge in production. Like I I would not have said, hey, when Rails 7 comes out that week, update your production to Rails 7. No, 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 no. Let it sit a little bit, and do some testing and staging and stuff. Make sure, but still being on 5.2 is too long. Had we been keeping up with things a little better, this would be a much simpler process. So, I wouldn't get two major versions behind in your production stack, because it just makes things bad. Because even trying to jump 5.2 to 6, most of our problems are in trying to figure out how to get all the gems updated to support that, and having to go back several years and go through all the changes they've gone through to figure out, okay, which version do we need to be on? Because we had to version several of the gems, lock in the versions, because they didn't necessarily say, hey, this version is limited to Rails 5.2 and this one's limited to 6. So some of the versions, when we did a bundle update, some of the versions of gems just jumped way past what we could use yet. So that was nifty. But, it's so a learning thing for all of you out there. Keep your Rails and your Ruby. There were a few issues with the Ruby update too, going from 2.6 to 2.7. Minor things, but still. Keep those things close to up to date and do it regularly. Keep your gems up to date, all that stuff. Makes life much easier when you have to go through these major updates. So, peanut butter. Here we go.
And jelly.
I know nothing about the Jamstack, so I'm excited to learn. I mean, I know what it is. I can't say I know nothing about it, but I don't ever program in this kind of architecture. So teach me, sensei.
Okay, so I'll start by kind of where the show idea came from. So basically, I was planned to do one of my websites, and into the history of me making websites, way back when I created I'll say the first website for the company, which was quite a long time ago. It was just a static site that you could upload to any hosting service, like DreamHost, if you remember that from years ago.
Jeez.
Yeah, because that's what it was. You just create your site. I think I probably made the first version in Dreamweaver and FTP'd it up there. So there you go.
Wait, that's a blast from the past that I don't miss at all.
Well, I mean, that's what you see is what you get editor to make a website. So, hey, it worked.
True.
The next one I did is I did it as a Rails app. So I actually just because I was like, hammer, nail. So I know how to do Rails apps. I'm going to do the next website. I'll just do it as a Rails app. And I just wrote the code to do it because I didn't want to. I had considered doing it in PHP, not PHP, I should say WordPress, but I'm like PHP and MySQL, and I got to learn all this new. No, I'm going to use the hammer and I'm going to hit the nails that I know. Mm-hmm. Well, eventually I was going to hire some people to generate some content. So I wasn't going to be writing something, but someone else was. And I actually paid for a service, and they said, we use WordPress to provide our service to you. So I'm like, all right, I'm finally going to get on WordPress. So I got on WordPress and I used one of the hosted solutions. So I was paying for the website to be hosted by someone who knows how to quote unquote run WordPress. But there were still all sorts of things that had to be configured and installed. And at least at the time that I did this, if you think JavaScript, when you're trying to bundle JavaScript together and you have dependency hell, it was kind of the same thing for WordPress extensions or whatever they call them. Mm-hmm. So I was dealing with that. And eventually I stopped using this, author service or the people who are writing the posts. And I was like, I'm going to drop WordPress like a bad habit because I hate this thing. So what I went to is a static site generator. So if you're not familiar with that, it basically, you hand code your HTML, or you can use any form of markup to do it. And then you write a command and it builds out the files. So you can create templates and it just statically builds them out. And then you can just FTP them somewhere, or like you used to do a Dreamweaver, right. Or you just, today, you would just stick them on a CDN so that it gets, global easy just distribution of your site. But it's essentially a static site. And Jekyll at the time, Jekyll was a very familiar one, Ruby based. I think GitHub started it, or someone affiliated with GitHub started it. And then Middleman is another gem, a Ruby static site generator. And that's actually the one that I started using. So basically all my sites are built with the Middleman static site generator, and there are links in the description for the video. So this is great for one person generating content, in my opinion, because you can then add in JavaScript to do certain things, but basically it's just creates your static HTML, CSS, JS files or whatever. But the problem becomes, what if you have more than one content creator? Now, if you have like a couple of developers, I'm sure you can coordinate using Git workflows or whatever to keep your repository up to date and do a build and then a deployment. But I was going to hire someone who is just a content writer. So what would be the easiest thing is for them to use some sort of a content management system to go to a form, fill out the form, write the content in a, that's going to be placed in there. So kind of like the WordPress interface offers, or other CMS, any CMS. Mm-hmm. And I was looking at this and I was actually considering, well, do I just want to go with a hosted web solution like Squarespace or something to keep it easy? Bless you.
Sorry.
Big sneeze there off mic. That's fine. So at that point, I was looking at what I was going to do, and I actually found some tools that would let you design a site for free using pre-built templates. And I said, oh, that'd be kind of cool if I could use that, but I wouldn't be using Squarespace. I wouldn't be a hosted solution. But then I found happened upon this concept of using a static site generator with a headless CMS. So that's the path I am currently pursuing. And I kind of wanted to talk about that from a Jamstack perspective. So now let's go ahead and get into what the Jamstack is. And basically, the Jamstack is the J is for JavaScript, the A is for API, and the M is for markup, some sort of markup. And I'll kind of consider this a third form of web application architecture. Like the original web application architecture, I'll call conventional web apps, are done by, you have pages that are generated when you visit, and they're usually based upon templates. But whenever you click a link, whenever a client clicks on a link, it gets routed to a particular page, and then that page is dynamically built based upon the template and the data, usually in a database. So each page gets essentially newly created every time. Now, that can be cached, of course, by the backend application server, or even a further out to the edge CDN. But basically, a page gets created every time.
So this is kind of the basic Rails type.
This is a Rails app. This is a WordPress is the same way. Most content management systems are the same. You know, it's the way Node.js operates.
Your basic operate, MVC type of.
And yeah. And with each interaction, each page that is sent, you get the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript sent down. Now, I'll contrast that with the other major way that people write web apps, and that's with doing a single page web app. So in that, I'll consider the pages as more of a virtual concept. And when you go to a particular route, essentially there's just one template because it's a single page. And that's downloaded, but a whole boatload of JavaScript to go down with it. And then it's JavaScript that actually says, okay, where are you going? You're going to this page. All right, hey, central server, give me the data so I can build the page. So it's actually the JavaScript that builds out the page just by, and what gets transferred between the server and the client is a lot of JSON.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the pages are rebuilt, but it's usually done by the client-side JavaScript. So it's very heavy on the client end. Now, this Jamstack is kind of a third way of doing it, where all of the pages are rendered at deploy time and they're stored in the CDN. So basically nothing's really dynamically built on the fly, or very few things are built dynamically on the fly. There is no backend application server, essentially. So if you want to use the Jamstack, you can do it without a backend application server, because you're just throwing your files on a CDN and a client pulls them down. Now, you do need probably some interactivity, and that's where JavaScript comes in, typically interacting with an API. So basically, the client pulls down HTML, CSS, and JavaScript from the CDN, and API calls handle any dynamic elements. So a good example of this type of application is basically the Rubber Duck Dev Show website. That is entirely static content. All files are stored on a CDN, and you're just pulling it down. The only interactive element on the whole thing is the form to collect email addresses if you want to sign up for our newsletter. And that is basically just an embedded form application that does it, but you could have done it, or we could have done it by having a JavaScript snippet that just sends it the email to an API to store it in a CRM or store it in a, email marketing application or whatever. So that's basically what the Jamstack is. Now, in terms of the advantages, one of the big advantages is performance. So everything is already on the CDN, already cached globally. You don't have to dynamically build a page for each person. Like, for example, imagine you're in Japan and you're visiting a site in the US. If you're visiting a Jamstack site, you're probably getting the files from somewhere in and at a CDN endpoint in Asia. Whoops.
Oopsies.
Anyway, whereas if you are using like a Rails app, that person actually, and you don't have a CDN distributing things, you're going to have to go all the way to the server in the US to be able to build the page and then send it all the way down to Japan. And for those who are listening on audio, he is now demonstrating a video showing the Jamstack workflow.
Yeah, I found a little diagram. Visual aids, pictures, they're the best.
So performance, because again, there's no server rendering required. There is higher security because again, you have no backend server you have to protect. Now you do have your APIs and your services, but perhaps you can somebody else is taking care of that depending on how your application is structured. And you can still have a backend server that runs your own API to do certain things if you want. But generally the core files are just all sitting out on the CDN. And because it's all on a CDN, it's much easier to scale and maintain because you just update the files in the CDN and it gets recached. So you don't have to worry about a farm of backend servers you need to manage or load balance or anything like that because it's all taken care of by the CDN. Now, in terms of when to use the Jamstack, and this is my opinion, other people may have different opinions, but I think it's good for sites with little dynamically generated data. So if most of your data is static, then the Jamstack makes all the sense in the world. Like, for example, I get informational websites. I can't imagine any of those not being built with a Jamstack,
like
essentially.
Most company websites, things that, you know, present the glossy brochures and the,
yes,
that kind of stuff.
And I even think some product websites, if they're like a static product catalog that doesn't change that much, that makes sense too. Because, go ahead and throw them in there. And because you can easily interact with an API if you actually want to do purchase a product, so you could, use some dynamic elements with that. I think that makes a lot of sense. But if most of your data is being rendered real time, then I think it starts making less sense. But it's not to say you can't do it because you can always have the client application, the JavaScript client application actually calls it the external API to get that data you need and renders it out. But depending on how much data you have to pull over and render out, you're going to lose some of your speed benefits because you're not relying upon the whole static page being pre-built.
Right.
Because you have to wait for an API call to pull down data to then merge it in for the client. But you can do that.
So what are the kind of the restrictions of this Jamstack? Like, when can I not use it? An example of.
I haven't thought about it from that perspective.
Because I'm thinking this would work for like a blog site where it's not changing often, or a marketing site where you're putting articles up. You got many people putting articles up, but it's not all real-time stuff.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can build anything with it, but anything that's like highly dynamic, being updated very quickly, I think it makes less and less sense because you're going to want to put. I think it makes less sense to do it that way, but I think you could build probably any application doing it this way.
Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering at what point, where is kind of the tipping point where it's better to use the Jamstack or it's better to not use the Jamstack in these situations. So if chat, if you got any ideas, please throw them in the comments. Any examples
Yeah,
of?
or opinions.
Yeah.
And because I haven't pursued this as a like I've never tried to build any complex application using this technique. And I haven't done any research into it just because,
Hmm.
I'm a Rails guy, I'm an Elixir guy or a Phoenix guy. So, I'm not gonna,
This isn't your bread and butter.
I got my hammer. So I'll use my hammer. See the nail, hit the nail. So there you
Right.
go. But I do recognize that I wouldn't want to set up a whole Rails application for a website, whereas using something like the Jamstack technique is perfect, you know, square peg,
Square
square
hole.
hole.
Right.
Exactly. All right. So now, so that's pretty much the Jamstack. Um, the other thing that I've been looking into that was actually on your posting there is that I haven't been with my solution. I haven't been using the Headless CMS that's in the orange
Hmm.
block there because I really wasn't familiar with them too much. But apparently, they've now become a thing, and I don't know how long. So basically, the static site generator I've been using is Middleman, and the way Middleman works is that you have a template per page, and you do dynamic elements by having YAML files with the data in them. So a particular template, you can look up data. So it's essentially one big file per page of relevant information for each page that fill in variables that you can fill in the template. So like, for example, I use this tech middleman for my scaling Postgres site. And I'm on the 200th episode, just had the 200th episode, 4 years of scaling Postgres
Wow.
content. And there are 200 pages for each one. And there's 200 entries with sub entries in this data YAML file. Now, the programmer in me, or I should say the database guy in me, that drives me bananas. But that's kind of how it's set up because there's no database. But as I was looking into this, there is a way to do something they're considering dynamic pages. And I'm sure other static site generators offer this as well. I just haven't looked into them. And I think I can configure it to be able to pull data from this headless CMS. So what that would mean is I don't have to have these 200 templates that 99% of the information in them is identical. So throw out that cruft. And I wouldn't need this 200 episode long YAML file in my project if I can simply do a call to an API, and that API is storing in a database all the different relevant information, the title of the episode, the slug for the episode, the YouTube video for it, whatever the podcast for, whatever the relevant information is for each episode. So I started looking into these headless CMSs, and they're exactly what you think. It's basically a database in the sky that you could say define these particular fields to store data, as well as you could put content, I'm assuming audios and videos. It's just a way to store content. And you use an API to pull down said content. So basically, my intent was kind of use one of these when I run the middleman build process. It would call that API at build time, build the static pages, and then I would deploy it. So basically, it's only called at build time
So a good
because when people are looking at the site, so nothing would be dynamic essentially still.
so a good use of this then would be like a marketing site or a company page where you've got several people putting articles into the Headless CMS system, the database,
Exactly.
but it gets
Exactly.
generated into static sites rather than pulling dynamically every time somebody visits that page.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and so that's my plan or the path that I'm going. And I'll probably actually try switching over the Rubber Duck Dev Show website using this headless CMS technique. If that works, then all right, I'll just probably transition all of them to using this. And
See, kids, we eat
so
our own
then,
dog food.
exactly, why else would we be doing?
We're not just blowing smoke. We do this stuff.
I choose the, if scaling Postgres was younger than Ruby Dev Show, I would start with scaling Postgres first. But I don't want to mess up the scaling Postgres one since that has,
A
it's the
lot.
bigger one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of this headless CMS, at this point, I came to the decision, all right, am I going to build my own or am I going to get a hosted service? So the easiest thing I looked at is a hosted service. And they also have open source software that does it too. So I looked in the hosted services, and basically a lot of the big ones or the good ones seem to be um, pretty expensive. And it's like per repository fees, which I'm talking like I've got like 4 or 5 different little mini websites, and I'm like, I don't want to pay this kind of money for
Yikes.
my static website. So I'm kind of like, so it's made for big corporate sites. You got a lot of people generated content. So I'm kind of like, there are some open source tools. One of the biggest ones, most popular ones is called, I don't know, STR API. I don't know if that's supposed to be string API or Strappy, or I'm not sure how you want to call it. The disadvantage with that is that, okay, it runs on Node.js. So if I do this, I got to set up Node.js myself and that whole solution. And again, it's not my trusty hammer. So I'm kind of like, I did look in, there are some Rails ones that offer headless CMS, but some of those were or haven't been kept up to date with Rails. Like their Rails 7 support looks really far off. So I'm kind of like, So at this point, what I'm considering, unless I find something new, I think I'm just going to roll it into, essentially, I have a small web app that I run for different small utilities that I do. And it's not really widely publicly available to do a lot of different things, but I'll probably just use that because it just needs to, essentially, what DHH does to say, hey, build a blog in 30 minutes. That's what I need is to build a blog, but it just won't render the pages. Instead, I'll just throw an API endpoint on it where you can pull down the blog entries that are entered.
Right.
So I'm probably going to do a roll my own because, again, it probably won't take that long to do unless I find something that,
So what
would be
about
easier to do or cheaper.
Jekyll? Isn't that a kind of the same thing as Strappy except for Ruby, and it's open source, right?
No, Jekyll's the same thing as Middleman. So it's a
I see.
static site generator. It is not a headless CMS.
So it's one part of this, but not the other part.
Right. You can swap out Middleman for Jekyll. Right, but it's not a headless CMS.
Gotcha. All right.
So given my knowledge of the hammer, meaning Rails, just throwing in a few additional features to this one existing web app would be, in my mind, the fastest and path and take the least amount of time and have the lowest amount of costs. So that's where I'm currently thinking about, unless something else pops up.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just want to step into it a little bit at a time. And it sounds to me kind of like the Jamstack is kind of splitting the difference between full MVC type architectures and pure static HTML architectures. It's kind of sitting in the middle somewhere there.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, you just enhance your interactivity with JavaScript is
Right.
essentially what it is. They're just, it's like ye old Dreamweaver static sites, FTP up to a host, but you're just using the Jamstack to generate your pages and send it to a CDN.
But with the
And just use
headless
JavaScript.
CMS stuff, you can still have distributed building
True.
going
Yes.
on.
Yes. That is the thing that I'm super happy I discovered, because I was going to potentially look at other solutions, or,
Right.
so I'm kind of glad I can use my existing tools, but just introduce this one additional concept. And now multiple content creators can easily create content using this solution.
Super cool. So it does go well with peanut butter. I knew it. All right.
There you go.
So that's the Jamstack, y'all. We're still on our discovery phase here of this. Creston more so than me, but
And really, I've been using the Jam essentially because of how I'm doing the websites. I've been using the Jamstack for years,
without knowing what it was called.
5+ years. I mean, I knew what it was called, but I'm like, hey, I'm using the Jamstack. I knew what it was. But the revelation that I discovered is this concept of headless CMS the concept of a headless CMS being available, that I could just call to actually build the static site.
Yeah.
That then opens up content using this technique that opens up the content creation for many authors versus maybe trying to coordinate two guys in a GitHub repository writing content.
Right. Well, as you get into developing this, we will look forward to updates and new discoveries on it. It'd be fun. It's an interesting, it's not really new technology. It's just a different architecture of technologies.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It just takes a little bit of this, a little bit. It's just a little bit different. I mean, all the same. It's different. It's a different mix.
Right. Seems like it works pretty well though. Well, for certain things. Again, viewers, if you have ideas and opinions about where kind of the tipping point is between Jamstack is good or no, go full MVC here, kind of like to hear your thoughts on that. So leave those in the comments.
Yep.
Also, if you enjoyed this, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You know how this works. I say it every week. Mash all the buttons and ding all the bells. Join us every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern time for more dev talk. Next week, do we even have a topic for next week? We were scrambling a bit today.
There was one listed, but I'm kind of like, I'm rethinking it, or let's say to be determined.
All right. So tell you what, chat, follow us on Twitter at @DuckyDevShow, and we will put up there when we decide what the topic's going to be for next Wednesday. If you have a topic you'd like to see on the show, please leave it in the comments below. We certainly will take your suggestions. Podcasts are available in all the places where podcasts live. And visit our site, rubberduckdevshow.com, to sign up for our newsletter and see a list of all of our episodes. Until next time, happy programming.
Happy programming.